Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Today, it's my enormous honor to welcome one of the secret superstars in the history of American music and art. He's long been acknowledged as one of the great geniuses of postmodern world music, and is a preeminent expert on musical culture, tradition, and instrumentation, ranging from Western classical music and jazz to film scoring and indigenous musical storytelling. And that ain't just hyperbole. Don't take my word for it. Take the words of his admiring collaborators, including Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, Charlie Parker, Monk, Diz, Mingus, Kerouac, Langston Hughes, Dylan, Seeger, Ginsberg, Corso, Sonny Rollins, Lionel Hampton, Stan Getz, Paquito de Rivera and Arturo Sandoval, Mary Lou Williams, Wynton Marsalis, Willie Nelson, Judy Collins, Arlo Guthrie, Phil Ochs, Peter Yarrow, Patti Smith. The list of his devotees just goes on and on and on. A disciple of Gunther Schuller, among other great musical geniuses, he was tapped by Joe Papp to compose for Shakespeare in the Park and by Maestro Bernstein as the New York Philharmonic's very first composer in residence. With Jack Kerouac and others, he virtually invented the Jazz Poetry Slam in 1957. And he wrote the scores to several groundbreaking films, including Splendor in the Grass, The Manchurian Candidate, and Pull My Daisy. The Woody Guthrie Foundation commissioned him as the composer for the towering classic Variations on the Great American Folk Song, This Land Is Your Land. And songwriter George David Weiss declared that his recording of George's What a Wonderful World was the second best cover of that tune by a genius, surpassed only slightly by the great Louis Armstrong. His creative accomplishments as an artist and educator are far too varied to fully catalog here. And so I'll just simply say to our guest, David Amram, recent winner of the National Music Council's prestigious American Eagle Award for 2024, welcome and congratulations on your continuing extraordinary career.
Thank you.
I want to cover a lot of ground because in your 92 years, you had a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom to offer. But I want to kick things off with a question that our young audience, I think, has on their minds. And we'll hear from them later, but we live in an age that's been pretty disillusioning, starting with the pandemic and other various political issues. You have always been a proponent of viewing music as an antidote to a lot of the things that get people down, and then as a way to move society forward. Can you riff a little bit on,
Sure.
On your philosophy about that?
Well, to begin with, to answer your question in a circumvented type of way, which is my specialty. When I was in Paris for the 50th anniversary of Shakespeare's books, I hadn't been there in 49 years, and it was just so wonderful to come back. The whole city was changed. When I was sitting at the Café du Magot, and there, if you can speak some French and you're friendly to people, everybody just comes up and starts hanging out and talking to you, regardless of who, where, what.
Sartre's old hangout.
So a gentleman sat down next to me and he said, what do you think of today's politics? How do you think about presidents? I said, I am not here really in that role. I'm just here to play music and hopefully make people feel as good as I feel just being back here. But I think that there are other people better equipped for that line of work. And I got, kind of a sour look. And he said, my dear boy, politics has been a dreadful mess for the last 2,000 years. Just enjoy your dinner. And the reason I mention that is because we can be so bogged down in not only geopolitics, which are beyond our control, but in our own personal mishaps, and especially if you're working in music or the arts where it's 3 times as hard, that you could forget about the beauty part, the joy, the good feelings that you get in yourself, and the good feelings that you can share with other people, and the good feelings that music gives to all of us just by being around it. Being around musicians, regardless of what genre they play, they always seemed to be what Odetta told me music's function was, which she said, darling, whatever your role in music is, music heals. And she always said, another thing was, I started out, speaking of herself, to be an opera singer. I was in Finian's Rainbow and stumbled into folk music through Joe Mapes, who was my roommate when we were in San Francisco for 3 weeks. And I just loved it. I became that. I became the Odetta that you know. She said, with everything you're doing, just remember, whatever you do, whether you're conducting a symphony or playing an Attica Prison or a Carnegie Hall, I've done all three, she said, folk is the root of the tree. And I think that all music goes back to that fundamental first cry of people responding probably to the first cry of an animal that they could hear and were associated with because life was a lot simpler. The first time someone banged a club against the floor, things that we can't understand today, languages that we've lost, but which are inside of our DNA ancestrally for the thousands, millions of years that the planet's been here, of which we're visitors. There's always been some kind of music going on, whether it was done by humans, by animals, or by the forces of nature, winds and the ocean crashing. These are beautiful, beautiful things, and we've discovered in every culture, regardless of the culture, regardless of the history, regardless of the sufferings of the people, some kind of beautiful music that's come. Music and dance and being together, singing, playing, dancing. Those are all human things that are so deep inside our soul. We can get so far removed from that in modern life. So if young people today are discouraged and disgusted, so were young people when I was a younger person. I'm only 93 now. I'm still a work in progress. And the older folks that I hung out with all said what a drag it was when they were young, but how music made them feel so good. And when you play in senior citizen centers, you see people get up and sing and dance and things that nobody even knows they can walk, and they'll get up and start doing something. Music is incredible. It's a mystery, but it's something that's very beautiful and also very rewarding to be a part of. And whether you are playing, composing, or just sitting and listening, you're a part of it. In music, everybody is part of the band.
Absolutely. And you've always spoken about the magic of following your heart into what it is that you want to do.
Definitely.
All of his young folks have chosen music as that course, but you also alluded to the people that you meet along the way. And Pete Seeger used to talk about that. And then no matter how discouraging a day was, at the end of the day, he knew that he had dealt with good people and fought the good fight. You've had an extraordinary career of meeting I gave an encyclopedic or a partial list of the folks. Going back to when you first came to New York, starting in the beginnings of the bop era, you dealt with all of those people as they moved into the Beat generation and everything else. Talk a little bit about that and some of the fun that you had.
Well, I would say that the people put up with me, and I think the only reason that they did was because they saw I was enthusiastic and interested in what they had to say. I met Trevor Gale today, who teaches all of you. What a fantastic guy. And I met you and some of the people that I knew from the wonderful group that brought me here from the Eagle Award that I got. But every single thing that happened to me since I first came to New York in 1955 to study on the GI Bill, study French horn, not composition, but French horn with Gunther Schuller, who was a wonderful French horn player. And also, by chance, stumbling and fumbling into Charles Mingus, who asked me if I would play with him. He thought it'd be nice to have a French horn. And the third week I was in New York, I was playing with all these people I'd never even dreamed I would get the chance to meet. And people in the symphony world and in the folk and poetry world, it wasn't networking of going around with saying who's important person at this networking party. Just what I call the University of Hangoutology. Just being with people and showing some respect and appreciation of them is the greatest education, and it continues to this very day. And I'm sure if I had more chance to speak to the students here, I'd learn a lot too. Mm-hmm. Because with my own kids and now my grandson, I don't know what's happening, how they feel, but I get more of a sense by hanging out with them and being with them and listening to them. And music, among other things, teaches you how to listen and how to appreciate how someone else might feel the same music. And that's the wonderful thing about music. No one is the authority. The whole idea of Achtung, you Schwein, I am the dictator and you're my typewriter key, might work in certain circumstances, I guess, if you're in the Navy SEAL in your life and death situation, then you don't have a chance to be that spiritual, perhaps. But in anything else, it's the spirit. And music strengthens the spirit, and it gets you through all of the hard times, all of the hardest times. It's called, in jazz, we used to call it the turnaround, where you take something that someone would mess up, and instead of making a nasty face, you go along with that so-called mistake and make it a plus and go from there.
So in so many ways, by being an observer, the I am a camera type alluding to Berlin in the 1930s, you were a camera as well as a participant in those very heady years of modern jazz. How important is it to be a repository of all of these stories and all of that history and to pass it on to future generations?
Well, I think the important thing is to try to pass on the beauty part, the spirit part, which is never passed on because no one ever made any money being kind, gracious, respectful, polite. The only money that possibly would be made would be if somebody was really super obnoxious and was able to sell T-shirts and temporary items of merchandise by being as revolting as possible, because then you were the other side of the coin. So when something horrible happened, people on the other side of the coin were able to create a cottage industry, usually lasting whatever the length of a kind of a fad is, a fashion statement. But generally, I think people in music aren't so concerned with what's fashionable or what's hip or trendy, but what's beautiful, why it's beautiful, how to make it more beautiful, how to try to have that beauty help you to do a better job and understand it. And all of that remains a mystery. And I think maybe it should be that way. When I played with Charles Mingus, Jackie McLean, who was way above my head, would go take me to his place, and we stood up all night long. About 5 a.m, I'd say, Jackie, remember Mingus sang this incredible arrangement? It was like a whole orchestra. And then I'd say, boy, Mingus, I don't know how you other guys can do it. Think of all this stuff in your head, sing all the voices. Jacob Collier does that now, but this was Mingus doing it back then, his own music. He said, well, you better do that tonight. He said, go home and practice. He said, tonight we're here to create, not to then we would go for the creation, and he'd do a whole different thing that we hadn't planned. We would do that more or less by ESP and addressing that mystery and feeling, well, I hope this is the right thing to do, like being thrown in the middle of the ocean when the ship goes off and you say, man, I better do something. So as we were sinking and swimming, I said, I remember, Jackie, you went, and I went, and you went, I said, don't talk about that. Don't talk about that stuff, man. I said, why? He said, that's sacred stuff. You're not supposed to talk about that. You're just supposed to hope that that happens, because that's the idea. And all the hard work that putting in and practicing and working hard to get the ability to do something only gives you the toolbox to be able, at that moment when the inexplicable happens, to do it. And that's the extraordinary thing that I encountered, not only with musicians, but with artists, with painters, and with people that were moving men, and all the waitresses and waiters and bartenders in the village who were the stars, the social stars of that particular era.
So you went from this incredibly improvisational community, including all the beat writers that just Kerouac, Corso, Ferlinghetti, all of those folks from San Francisco. And the folk movement starts in Greenwich Village, and you begin to go into film, which is two far more regimented communities in terms of their belief system and tradition.
Yeah. Well, I didn't decide to go into the film. I didn't choose to do that. I was writing music for Shakespeare in the Park and off-Broadway plays and playing jazz with my own group and with Kenny Durham and other fantastic musicians that are a blessing in my life every day just to think about them. And the wife of John Frankenheimer, whom I didn't know, came to all the off-Broadway plays I had written music for, and they were doing Turn of the Screw on NBC television, and they wanted something that wasn't Joe Hackavision and his 12 ghostwriters whip out some music cues from a drawer and grind them in, and then someone else homogenizes it, and they stick it in the background the way they do using music for an elevator or to make people maybe buy something or not pay attention or not hear any music in their head. So she kept saying there's this young guy and I think his kind of music would really fit in. So out of the blue, he called me up and I did the music for Turn of the Screw and it won an Emmy, not me, but the Ingrid Bergman was in it. So he said, well, we're doing one called The Young Savages. And I had done Pull My Daisy, which was kind of a home movie that now has become a cult classic, supposedly. But at the time, we did it just for kicks. And I appeared in it as a non-actor. All of us in the cast were not actors, which we proved by our non-performances, which in spite of that, Kerouac's narration was so great that it came across. And I said, well, sure. He said, well, you went to Manhattan School and you played with Latin bands and you got the symphony stuff and jazz and you're a classical composer. I think you could do it. I'd never done a film score. I said, sure. So at great personal hassles, he got me to do the scores by the fact that they didn't want me, which they let us know constantly that you're about to be fired. And I got Harold Land, who had played with before Sonny Rollins played with Max Roach and Clifford Brown, just these wonderful players, jazz players, Latin players, and symphony players, and did the score. And they liked it, so they asked me to do Splendor in the Grass. I worked with Kazan in the theater, and then The Manchurian Candidate. And at that point, I was 1962, I could have been Mr. Music Cue writer and gotten 12 ghostwriters, a big house, a staff of 10 people to orchestrate everything and gone to parties and hustled to get gigs. And I just felt that wasn't what I was here for. So I spoke to Elmer Bernstein, who's a wonderful, wonderful composer. He said, what are you doing next, man? I said, well, I'm writing music for the Park Avenue Synagogue, a Friday night service. He said, really? You're going back to New York for that? He said, well, sure, I got a commission and it's due next fall. He said, how much are they paying you? I said, $500. And he almost fell off of his chair because he was already a millionaire. But he said, you really want to do it? I said, sure, man. That's part of my heritage, and it's a wonderful chance to write a piece and get it played in here. And I said, I really want to be a composer and am a composer. And he said, good. I didn't have to worry about my taking any jobs away from him. First of all, he could have retired then. And secondly... You
might have ended up doing The Great Escape.
No. And secondly, he was terrific at what he did. And all the other composers were there said they all got writer's block. Unless it was for a film, they couldn't do it. And they all had to use other people to write their stuff. And if I could survive somehow, it'd be great just to continue following my heart and doing my dream. They thought that was kind of nice and unusual. So against the advice of my lawyers and all the experts I met, I decided to pursue the path that I'm still on. And at 93, what I decided to do over 60 years ago now. I'm happy that I made those career death wishes, and I hope everyone else in the world does the same thing. Not a career death wish, but to follow what you love to do. And now at this point, since I'm lucky to have lived long enough, a lot of rewards or recognition is finally coming in. And fortunately, I'm old enough to handle it, because when you get to be 93, you're lucky if you can even remember what's happening yesterday. So you don't have a chance to have any egotistical thing, because you met so many great people that are better than you'll ever be, that it kind of keeps you in a good place.
But you certainly were on the ground floor of the turnaround in Greenwich Village toward the political. Did that play a role in following your heart?
Yes, up until the point when I went to, when I worked for Bella Abzug, who I loved, 1970. She was fantastic. And
that was her district, wasn't it?
Yeah, and she won the election. We went down to the Lion's Head Bar. It was like a miracle. I said, this is like a miracle that this woman won the election. What a wild thing. And the guy said, no. He said, since the other candidate was bringing in dead people and using their names and bringing people in wheelchairs with dementia to vote 3 times, he said, we jammed the voting machines. I said, really? And as a lifelong Democrat who loved Franklin D. Roosevelt, we all of us who came up during the Depression, just his voice, made us feel good. I suddenly got a different view of politics, which was, it's a huge business that we have no concept of. And I follow it, and I did some anti-war demonstrations, but then when I saw how the Vietnam veterans were treated when they came home, I'd been in during the Korean War, and people simply spat on us or cursed us for wearing a uniform. But when I saw people like that coming back and being assaulted by people that I assumed were progressive, liberal people, I got kind of discouraged. And now I still vote, and I'm still interested, and I still watch, unfortunately, all the different channels but I try to do what the gentleman in Paris told me to do, which is just to enjoy my meal and to try to work hard in music and hope that that does some good beyond politics, because I honestly think that music survives. And when I see what happens to politicians when suddenly they're not hot anymore, it's like a lot of people that were doing terrific in pop music and suddenly their sales go down and they're back in the gas station and say, what happened? But they weren't committed in their heart to the music as almost a calling in the first place. I think, without sounding, elitist, that music is on a much higher level, more important, more valuable, more lasting, and better for the world society than politics are. And even the most oppressive, disgusting political ripoff of other people, which has been going on since the beginning of time, can take a second place because we don't even remember. There's nothing you can whistle about some of a melody from anything of the disgusting periods that we've gone through. And if you really look back on, I was a history major in college. If you look back on history, you can see that so much there's always been an oppressor, and those who are oppressed. So all we can do in music, if we have a band, is to treat everybody in the band with love and respect and acknowledge them. Or if you're conducting a symphony, make the musicians feel good, stay out of the way and let the music happen. And if you're a composer, hope that you can add something to the repertoire. And we have something positive to contribute every second that we're here. I think in politics there are people like that. Unfortunately, they usually receive a terrible ending before their time, generally speaking, because that has never been a big seller. It's always idealism. There's a price to pay for that. The price that we pay perhaps is to stay in the low income bracket or the almost no income bracket. But we do have the thrill and the joy and the love of what we're doing and the wonderful friends that we make throughout the time. So I guess if some galvanizing person came along in the political scene that I was really loved and respected enormously, I'd go out and campaign for them vociferously and go to demonstrations, go get arrested and do all that stuff again. But at this point, I'm sure there are people like that, and my hope is that they'll get into politics. The one guy who was in the band of New Orleans was the name of the band. He was terrific, but he only ran one term. And I knew him as a guitar player before he went into politics. He said, man, the day I got to Congress, I found out my gig, most important thing in the gig, was my first day, was to raise money for 2 years from now when a re-election comes up. And I thought, boy, that's sad to hear, but I'm glad. I hope he's playing the guitar again because he was a good guitar player.
Well, didn't Louisiana have a governor who wrote "You Are My Sunshine" or claimed to have?
Sure.
So he wrote that for a good long time. Didn't have to raise money.
Oh, of course.
It can happen. It sounds as though you feel that music has an ancillary role to play, not only in enhancing your own life, but in terms of contributing towards social progress.
Yeah.
But not necessarily an overt political role, which
No.
I think.
I think that musicians are used by or politicians would like to use musicians in order to get elected.
Yeah.
And I understand that their goal in life is not to create something beautiful, but to get elected, get in a higher office until maybe they reach the president, and that they're like people who love music. They want to be a conductor, and all they want to do is conduct the New York Philharmonic. So if you see them conducting the Hogwell Doctors Orchestra in Tennessee, and here they are with a bunch of good players,
Yep.
and they're looking at that terrible look on their face. I hate this job. I hate these people. My career sucks. And the poor musicians have to sit there with this awful. The thing I admire in anybody, in junior high school band directors who never get any credit for anything, who love music and nurture people to play, whether or not they're going to be musicians, or sports teams where they have people doing it because they love to do it, or people who Habitat for Humanity, where everybody gets together with nails and builds houses. People doing stuff together. And I think that with the economic downturn, the idea of community music, community arts, small is beautiful, is coming back out of necessity, and out of that will be some wonderful things. All those things that we spoke of earlier that were so iconic that I was part of didn't, at the time, make anybody much of anything except a handful of people, and most of them felt so guilty they were being recognized. It was essentially done by a whole bunch of people just being together at a certain time without any overwhelming political philosophy, except the old famous Jewish prayer, V'ahavta l'recha chamoka, to love your neighbor as thyself. And Sonny Rollins told me the basis of golden rule and every major religion in the world comes to the fact that we should be with one another. And music, of all the arts, along with the theater, but especially music, because there's only one language, or many languages, but one language that we all speak or learn to speak. The music does that. It brings us together.
All the rest is commentary. And speaking of community, we've got this entire community, and I want to monopolize this conversation. Let's get some folks involved. Anybody have any questions for David that you might want to ask?
What was that like magical musical moment for you that made you realize I want to like dive deeper and begin to understand like other instruments and how to play them?
Well, I think, I'm playing French horn, which is my instrument. I always enjoyed so many things in life outside of the Wagnerian world the French horn's associated with. And French horn players, I always found out were very, very collegial. We all had that thing in common of knowing we could miss notes. So we were all accustomed to failure as being part of a good life. And I went to a lot of different events that French horn players I knew could read books and listen to music and look at paintings and stuff would like. And I was always interested in those different things, as most of us are in music, because music opens up your mind to sports, theater, drama, everything. And the people that I met sometimes would be playing. I said, boy, I'd like to do that, but somehow the French horn didn't fit in. So I had little penny whistles I began playing just for fun. And there's that famous thing on YouTube now where I'm playing with Dizzy, playing the two whistles. But the first time, after knowing him 30 years, he said, well, I'd like to hear that whistle. I heard a guy said, I just played French horn and percussion, so I brought the penny whistle. Then I did the thing playing the two penny whistles at once. Everybody went, ah! And after it was over, he pulled his glasses down and he said, are you going to bring them whistles to the next gig? And I said, and I thought, this sophisticated guy like that doesn't want to hear the summer camp entertainment. I said, well, if you want me to, Diz, of course I will. He said, people love that shit. And it made me realize that in spite of the fact he was so sophisticated harmonically and rhythmically, and he also wanted people to have a good time. So he saw, well, for a certain moment, that would be effective. And all the other instruments I learned just from going different places and hanging out and seeing something, saying, boy, that sounds so beautiful, and then trying to learn a little bit about it. And when I had the Shania, which is kind of a Middle Eastern form of the oboe, one of the many forms, I was in Sri Lanka, and they had a fantastic player. And he had on a turban and everything, he was playing away with circular breathing. And I was there for the State Department. I was their ambassador of good cheer at $50 a day. So it didn't matter if I got kidnapped as long as I got a good review somewhere. And this guy was amazing. So suddenly he was playing for about 2 minutes and he opened up his eye just to see if the weird American was paying any attention or not. And we saw, then he played about another half hour, and then he showed me a lot of stuff, And I found out the musicians in every culture that I've been to, every place I've been to, actually appreciated our music and knew a lot about our music. We didn't know anything about their music. And then I realized most of us don't know anything about our own music. So I said, boy, I got to come back and start checking everything out. And it also opened up my mind to the relationship of a lot of those folk instruments to the symphonies. So when I was doing the young people's concerts, I would show the double reeds, the bassoon, English horn, and oboe by playing something on the Shania, and then showing when it became Europeanized and these fantastic players that could play. And the clarinet being a single reed instrument, but with the same story. Then taking the string family of violins, violas, cellos, and basses, and taking some of the wonderful folk instruments, string instruments from all over the world, and showing how those developed eventually into the string instruments, viols as they had in the consort of viols, and then finally becoming part of the symphony world, of the classical world. And with the piano, showing the kalimba and the African thumb piano, and how that became, on the history of the piano, starting out from the clavichord, harpsichord, piano, Broad Street piano, when it got bigger, so Beethoven could pound out the low notes, and the whole amazing development. And then for the brass family, I had the shofar that they use, and explaining you only get 1 gig a year, and people learn how to play that. But it was the walls of Jericho were blown down by the first form of a trumpet, and then how that became a brass, all that stuff.
A ram's horn.
Yeah, and then we would play something by Wagner featuring, and each piece we played would feature that family so the kids could see the antecedents of the instruments, and they'd also see the family in the orchestra who was playing them, and then they had people stand up and play a little solo. And they said, what do you want us to play? I said, man, just play anything. Show how good you are, whatever you enjoy. The people in the orchestra are going to enjoy hearing you do it, and just do whatever you feel. So they all would go and practice the hardest thing to impress all their friends, and everybody in the orchestra would go, yeah. So the kids were already in seeing the other musicians enjoying what we were doing. So that opened up the door. So when we played the piece, it just was, either putting everybody to sleep or throwing paper clips. And it was a lot of fun doing that, because basically they wanted the young people's concerts to be Pop Goes the Weasel and Broadway hits homogenized to the. So it was helpful in music education programs to do that. And then when there wasn't an orchestra, to go around with the different instruments and play and jam with other people and play music from different places. But it wasn't anything I planned. It was something I was always interested in, and gradually I started doing more of it, as I've done with a lot of other things. I never really planned anything in my life, except if I was asked to write something, as your question was, I would manage somehow get it done on time. My computer just crashed and got hacked, and I had to keep it closed now until my second daughter could help me to fix it and get another one. But I said, okay, I used the time this morning, instead of feeling how tragic it was that this happened to me, to work on this violin piece, and it gave me more time to work on the piece that I'm supposed to finish. So I think you can use, I don't mean to go off the first subject. You can use adversity sometimes to your advantage.
Let me add something to that. When Odetta said to you, going back to the root,
Yeah.
talking about folk music, is going back to the root instruments an important element of that, a necessary element, or is it something else entirely?
I think it's just interesting. It's just something I fumbled and stumbled into and said, wow, it really, the only problem is if you get it with a super ethno-funkologist who they used to call them folk Nazis in the 70s, saying, that's not authentic picking, usually by someone who'd never met anybody from the world where that picking took place and wouldn't hang out with them if they did, because the snobbery, trying to make a cottage industry out of maintaining purity isn't necessary either, because some of the wonderful folk artists I know, and jazz artists and classical artists, would say that the music is almost that you write down on paper is kind of a network, a road guide, a GPS for anybody taking that music to express themselves, and a vehicle towards creating music for people to be listened to, rather than he's a composer, or he's a modern composer, or he's a 12-tone composer, or he's a minimalist, or this or that, giving all those names and then forcing you to take something that's supposed to be creative into a certain prison cell where you're not allowed to speak to other people in the other prison cells. And you can have high standards and still appreciate a whole bunch of other people who also have high standards, and sometimes the history of music that goes back before there was any Western civilization at all. When I learned the hula sai when I was in China, and I heard some of the players there, and realized some of that music goes back thousands of years. The Hui dynasty was like 4,000 something, and there's still, everybody's checking that out that I met at the university in Chengdu, learning about that and feeling at home with something that happened 4,000 years ago. Not to mention the alphabet. I asked some woman, she was a Hebrew teacher at this temple, Reform temple. I said, man, how could she learn, being brought up in Queens And she said, well, I learned Chinese as a child. That was 3,000 characters plus variations. You've only got 26. She said, I learned it in a week. It was a piece of cake. And I thought, wow, there's cultures where people, all over the world can learn just the alphabet like that. That's really something else.
David, thank you so much for joining us here, for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, all the fun stories, and just schmoozing with us. It was wonderful. Please come back, and thank you all for joining us for the National Music Council video series. Be sure to check out other NMC resources on fair use, protecting free speech in the global music landscape, and our resource paper on music, politics, and history that traces repression against music creators around the world. All are available on the NMC website at musiccouncil.org. For the National Music Council, I'm Charlie Sanders, and we'll see you again soon.